Kano Drachia of Ether. A distant descendant of the first emperor, Kano was born with the raw power of the dragon's fire within his veins, able to summon flames as easily as breathing. As a court wizard, he lives within the royal palace, enjoying comforts unknown to the masses of Volcor. In recent years, something has been stirring, slow and insidious, disrupting the flow of ether within Volcor. Wizards throughout the court have been struggling to control their innate magic, finding difficulty in casting even the simplest etheric spell. When Kano stumbles upon a mysterious being dwelling within the body of his former mentor, he uncovers a secret that threatens to overwhelm the innermost circles of the royal court. In exposing the threat before the Chamber of the Dragon, Kano manages to gain the gratitude of the Emperor himself. Wielding his unique ether affinity, Kano is gifted the title of Drachia of Ether, sent to uncover the truth and correct the imbalance of ether before every wizard in Volcor is left powerless. Playing with fire. The combined nervous chatter of 40 young wizards was almost deafening, bouncing off the walls in a way that made his ears ring. Rio looked around the room, gazing at the tense expressions of the other students gathered nearby. One of the youngest in the room looked as if she was going to pass out, her face pale with anxiety, small hands trembling as she teased a flame into existence between her fingers. Rio ran a hand over his already immaculate robes, straightening the fabric with a small frown. Despite his age, he was already wearing the Apophis hairpin that marked him as the Hideshi heir, its obsidian scales gleaming in the firelight. Noting the curious stare of a couple of older students, Rio dipped his head in greeting, watching as their gaze landed on the hairpin. One of them turned slightly to whisper in the other's ear, hiding the movement of his lips behind one hand. Finally, the Lord Wizard Akihiko strode into the room, instantly gathering everyone's attention. The crimson fabric pulled around his feet as he came to a halt, raising one hand.
I need each of you to find a brazier and stand next to it.
He paused, blinking slowly.
Now, if you please.
The students burst into a flurry of movement as each one rushed to find a brazier. Rio stepped behind the nearest brazier, looking down at the golden glow seeping out onto the polished stone tiles.
I believe most of you will have already heard about the Trial of Embers before, but for those of you who haven't, I will start from the beginning.
Clearing his throat, the Lord Wizard Akihiko gestured to the nearest brazier.
The rules are simple. What you see before you is lava harvested from the crater of Mount Volcor. Your task is to draw it from the brazier. This may seem simple, but lava is much harder to manipulate than fire or ether. This trial is designed to determine your innate abilities and your potential as the future wizards of Volcor. The most successful among you may be chosen by one of the Lord Wizards as a Dashai and assume the responsibilities of...
Rio noted several of the students beginning to zone out, their eyes glazing over as they stared off into the distance. If their overseer took any notice, he didn't show it. The Lord Wizard's footsteps echoed through the room, the click-clack of his shoes against the stone tiles, rebounding off the walls. Rio's gaze followed the Lord Wizard as he paced down the line of students, staring ahead with his chin held high.
Of course, there are still rules that must be obeyed. This is a test of aptitude and natural ability, and so the use of any arcane item is prohibited. Each of you has descended from the first Emperor of Volcor, gifted with the blood of the Drachia. As members of the royal bloodline, you are blessed with an affinity for fire ether.
The student next to Rio had his head bowed, staring intently at something in the palm of his hand. His long, jet-black hair was pulled up into a high ponytail, only decorated with a single verlin feather. The other boy wore his dark grey robes with pride, his dark eyes gleaming with a keen intelligence, expression alight with mischief. He looked slightly older than Rio, perhaps 15 at most. Rio startled at the feeling of something hitting his ankle, glancing over to the student to find him grinning, balancing his weight on one foot as he prepared to kick again. Rio pointedly ignored him, lips thinning as he continued to stare at the Lord Wizard Akihiko.
More than welcome to observe others or otherwise prepare for your trial, but do not converse with other students. This is a test of natural ability, and giving another student advice or information is strictly prohibited. Of course,
just as Rio thought the other boy had given up, he felt a hand slide into his pocket. The boy withdrew, quietly leaning back into his usual spot. After a moment, Rio reached into his pocket with one hand, withdrawing a small slip of parchment. Slowly, he turned to look over his shoulder, glancing at the other student. "Read it." The whisper was just barely audible, but even watching the boy's face, Rio wasn't sure he hadn't seen his lips move. Rio lifted one eyebrow before looking down at the note in his hand, fingers cupped to hide it from view. He could see the script faintly shimmering on its surface, just barely visible in the light. Turning silently, he glared at the other boy, gesturing silently to the note. "What is this?" Rio hissed under his breath, gaze flicking to the Lord Wizard, watching him heading back toward them. "An incantation," the boy shrugged. "A few of us have got 'em. It'll help with your magic."
"Now!"
the Lord Wizard Akihiko suddenly boomed, his voice rising as he came to a halt in the dead center of the room. "Your trial begins. Show me what you can do." Rio glanced back at the other boy, who was watching him with one eyebrow raised. "The Lord Wizard said, 'It's just a simple incantation. It's not that different to the ones we've covered before.'" Rio looked over the symbols with a small frown, recognizing only a few of the words. "All the wizards use it for this trial. It helps with concentration." They both paused at the sound of a distressed cry, turning to look at one of the wizards across the hall. The same girl that Rio had noticed earlier was standing over her brazier, tears in her eyes as the molten lava melted the remains of the metal, pouring out onto the stone tiles. The Lord Wizard, standing nearby, shook his head as he moved on to the next student. "You only get one shot. You really want to end up like her?" The boy looked back at Rio with a shrug. "Your choice, I guess." As the other student turned back to his own brazier, Rio frowned, looking down at the note in his hand. With a small sigh, he nodded to himself. Straightening, he stretched his free hand towards the brazier, palm facing the lava pooled within. Rio muttered the incantation under his breath and with a gesture began to draw the lava up into the air. The lava answered sluggishly, pushing back against Rio's control. He could feel its resistance, as if he were trying to force it through a wall of solid stone, and even with all of his concentration, he could barely command it to move. It rose painfully slowly, almost solid, as it moved up through the air, obstinate, despite Rio's best efforts. A vein twitched in his forehead, his face flushing with the sheer effort of commanding the lava to move. As a bright flare lit the opposite end of the hall, his tentative focus shattered and his control over the lava snapped. It fell back into the brazier with a strange hollow sound, not unlike the strike of metal on metal. What splashed over the sides quickly cooled against the stone tiles, solidifying before Rio could think to remove it. The Lord Wizard, Akihiko, was silent as he passed, gaze fixed on the pool of lava splashed across the stone tiles. With a gesture, he allowed the remainder to extinguish, and Rio watched silently as the brazier's contents cooled to a dull grey. Rio glanced around the hall to find several others in the same position as himself, their heads bowed. Some had braziers that appeared to be one solid mass of rapidly cooling rock. Others had accidentally reduced theirs to a puddle of molten metal and lava. The Lord Wizard, Akihiko, looked between them all with a dark expression, silently stalking past those among them who had failed. Just as he opened his mouth in preparation to speak, a bright flare of light caught everyone's attention. The boy to Rio's left, the same one that had passed him the note, was weaving his lava through the air with a bright grin, his face alight with a crimson glow. Its movements were almost serpentine as it danced around him, glowing brighter with every second. The molten rock became thinner and thinner as the lava superheated, transforming into a vibrant golden orange. The lava curled outward, cooling into a mass of scales, whiskers sprouting from the head of the serpentine form. A pair of horns formed from the top of its head, a mouth separating to reveal a series of sharp teeth, the tongue lolling out as it opened its mouth and roared. With a burst of flame, the lava took the shape of a dragon, burning brighter with each passing second. The dragon circled him in one massive loop, weaving through the air, illuminating the wizard's triumphant grin. With a gesture, he sent the dragon flying towards the ceiling, brushing just shy of the rafters before diving back down into the brazier, releasing a shower of molten rock. They paused just before they hit the floor, reversing their trajectory to land back inside the brazier, and the mass of lava coalesced back into one molten pool once more. Rio heard several of the other students gasp behind him and turned slightly to see the Lord Wizard drawing closer, something unreadable, barely visible within his carefully blank expression.
Well done, Kano. Good work.
After a long moment, the Lord Wizard finally gave Kano a simple nod before turning back to the other students, continuing on to inspect those remaining. Over the glow of his brazier, Kano grinned, winking at Rio. "What was the incantation you gave me?" he asked, watching the other wizard with a small frown. I found it in a tome in the palace library." "You didn't know what was going to happen?" "It worked when I used it. I don't know what went wrong when you tried." Kano met his gaze with a blink, shrugging. "Hey, could have helped. I didn't know it would backfire. Anyway, you're not the only one." Rio turned slightly to look at some of the other students who had failed, staring at the state of their braziers. "You do realise that the Lord Wizard will find out, right? Everybody's going to know you cheated." Kano shrugged. "Worth it." As the other students began to filter out of the room, Kano followed suit, giving Rio a little wave as he left through the main door. The few of them that had used Kano's incantation were kept behind subjected to a long lecture from the Lord Wizard, and questioned about the results of their trial. Mysteriously, all of them realised that Kano's notes had disintegrated into fine powdery ash, erasing the only evidence of the incantation. Deep within the royal palace, the 78 members of the Chamber of the Dragon were gathered in the Great Hall. The gold leaf panel at the back of the room almost seemed to shimmer in the lantern light, disguising a passage leading to the innermost section of the palace.
The trial of embers took place this morning. Of the 28 students that were tested, 19 successfully completed the trial.
The Lord Wizard Akihiko hesitated, clearing his throat.
One of these students displayed the aptitude of Caldera.
A low murmur rippled through the room as the Chancellor frowned, dipping his chin to stare at Akihiko.
That's impossible for a wizard of his age. We couldn't find any rune stones or charged crystals. The brazier was unmarked, and we did not find evidence of a sigil. I cast the etheric wand myself, and its efficacy was tested by 3 senior wizards. The boys should not have been able to cast or draw ether.
The Lord Chancellor frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully.
Interesting. Keep a close eye on him, Lord Wizard Akihiko. If he truly did use an etheric spell, in spite of your words, this student of yours may prove useful.
Smoke and mirrors. Across the rolling hills of Volcor, the earth was stained black with soot and ash, lava rivers a smear of colour against the dark landscape. Villages lay tucked between the rocky slopes, ruled by generals, their fate determined by the ebb and flow of battle. Step into any one of Volcor's villages and you'll find a hardy people, determined and headstrong, forged by the inhospitable environment they call home. Beyond them, the silhouette of Mount Volcor rises above the rocky slopes, a massive active volcano which can be seen from the furthest borders of the region. A plume of toxic smoke and poisonous gases rises into the air, painting the sky in shades of grey and blocking out the sun for months at a time. A path cut into the slope of the volcano leads to the Imperial Palace, an imposing structure carved from obsidian and stone. The palace extends deep below the earth, a massive network of underground halls providing a home for every member of the royal court. It stands apart from the villages far below, equal parts magnificent and formidable, separated from the rest of Volcor by a series of stone walls and grand gates. Within the palace walls, the hallways were bustling as servants began to prepare for the evening meal. Young wizards making their way to and from various training exercises. Lengths of scarlet fabric hung from the ceiling, adding a vibrant splash of colour to the stone halls, carved from the volcanic rock found throughout Volcor. The golden pink of rhyolite was streaked through the dark stone, revealed through cracks and fissures in the rock. In some places the rock had been chiselled away to reveal pockets of pure rhyolite, providing a clear space for a sigil to be inscribed into the soft pink stone. Great golden lanterns illuminated the halls, casting everything they touched in a soft, warm glow. Crystals formed from molten magma radiated the warmth of the midday sun, chasing away the chill of the shadows. Soft woven mats lay underfoot, a sharp contrast to the unyielding stone beneath. Doorways were marked with finely painted screens depicting scenes of Volcor's history, the emperors that came before, and the legendary dragon that gave life to the fires of Volcor. A court wizard strolled down one such hallway, his crimson robes a splash of colour against the pale mats and dark stone walls. The crimson fabric was bordered in fine gold embroidery set against the jet-black skirt of his robes. In one hand, he held a staff carved from pure obsidian, gold detailing running along its length. His hair was drawn up into a high ponytail, decorated with a large, blood-red feather plume, which was held in place by an intricate golden hairpin. As he strode down the hall, Kano came to a stop near one of the sigils embedded in the wall, weaving a spell into the air with his free hand. Most of the court's wizards weren't required to perform such menial tasks, but most wizards had already received a title and become a true member of the royal court. Kano, still awaiting a title, was still included within the group of young wizards that worked to maintain the spells around the palace. When he checked, the sigil was in the first stages of unravelling, showing faint signs of etheric disturbance. Sighing, he began the process of casting the sigil once more, knitting the wisps of ether. While tedious, repairing sigils wasn't the worst of Kano's menial tasks. That dubious honour belonged to the water seals. To someone with the blood of the dragon running through his veins, performing water magic felt inherently wrong, like having your body flipped inside out. As he approached one of the seals that maintained the palace's water system, he shuddered involuntarily, expression morphing into one of distaste. Drawing on the ether around him, Kano tapped into the magic of the arcane seal, grimacing as the impression of cool running water washed over him. Reweaving the seal as quickly as possible, he bound the spell with a shiver. Just as he released the flow of ether, Kano heard a large, shuddering boom echo down the hall, the very air around him vibrating with a release of arcane energy. The door to one of the training rooms burst open as one of the young wizards collapsed through the doorway, screaming in agony. Flames raced up the side of his robes, covering his writhing body in a blanket of fire. Another wizard immediately followed him, lowering herself to the ground at his side. Minako's face was set with determination, teeth gripped tightly as she quickly worked to draw the fire away from her student. Kano could feel the pull from across the room as the fire clung to the young wizard's body, refusing to budge. Minako gave one last tug, and the fire flew into her waiting hands. With a flourish, she stifled it between her palms, skin untouched by the heat of the flames. Next to her, the apprentice gave a strangled groan. In spite of her best efforts, the fire had burned through parts of his clothing, leaving the skin beneath a bright, searing red. Even at this distance, Kano could see that the edges of his burns were already beginning to peel. Two of the servants walking nearby immediately ran over, already hurrying to obey Minako's rapid-fire orders. As he watched, several more students emerged from the room, rushing to help their mentor.
Third one this week.
Kano turned to find the Lord Wizard, Akihiko, standing next to him, his expression unreadable.
This is the second from among Minako's students.
This has happened twice already. Akihiko nodded, jaw clenched. I don't recall anything like that happening in our class.
It's been more frequent recently.
As one of the servants rushed past them, a large bowl of water clutched close to her chest, the Lord Wizard turned to look at Kano with a sigh.
Walk with me.
As they walked, Kano occasionally stopped to check another of the sigils, repairing and reweaving the spell with a wave of his hand. For the most part, the Lord Wizard Akihiko remained unusually silent.
So, Kano, how did you pass the trial of embers again?
Kano shook his head, chuckling at the familiar subject. I told you, Lord Wizard Akihiko. It was just a stroke of good luck. A happy accident. A moment of genius. I couldn't possibly explain it. The Lord Wizard merely sighed in response, his expression strained. Expecting some kind of quip in return, Kano waited, surprised when nothing else followed. The Lord Wizard, Akihiko, remained quiet, allowing the silence to stretch between them. After a long moment, Kano cleared his throat. Well, I guess it's been 10 years now. The Lord Wizard's head swiveled toward him, an eyebrow raised in question. It was an incantation I found in an old tome to strengthen a person's connection to the arcane. The Lord Wizard's expression went completely blank, his gaze appearing to stare straight through Kano rather than looking at him.
You used an incantation to modify your connection to the arcane?
Yes. The Lord Wizard shook his head, muttering to himself.
That doesn't make any sense. The wards should have prevented. What kind of incantation was this?
Etheric.
That's not possible!
He hissed, mouth curling into the beginnings of a snarl. Then, abruptly, the Lord Wizard paused.
You gave the same incantation to the other students, didn't you?
Yes. It didn't work as well for them, though. Kano watched as the Lord Wizard's face almost seemed to clear, mouth curling into a crooked smile, a chuckle escaping him.
How interesting.
With another laugh, he continued strolling forward, seemingly oblivious to Kano's look of confusion.
Do you often use ether spells and incantations?
Yes. I enjoy casting fire, but using ether in spell work is more interesting. I found some spells in an old tome, so I started teaching myself how to cast them, and then learned how to magnify my fire magic with ether spells.
Was it difficult?
At first, yes. Kano hesitated, gesturing vaguely in the direction they'd come from, to the student who had collapsed to the ground in flames. I haven't told anyone this, but I've noticed something happening to the ether recently. It feels wrong somehow. Warped. I don't know how to explain it. I just can't shake this feeling that something big is going to happen. That strange smile was still tugging at the Lord Wizard's lips, transforming what may have been intended as an encouraging nod into something vaguely menacing.
I understand, Kano. I've been getting that same exact feeling recently.
The Lord Wizard paused, staring into the middle distance.
We should go to speak to the Chamber of the Dragon. They should hear this.
Without waiting to hear Kano's reply, the Lord Wizard Akihiko began walking down the hallway, pausing only for long enough to check that Kano was following. The Lord Wizard led him down several levels, descending into the innermost levels of the palace. As one of the younger members of the court, and titleless at that, Kano had never had the opportunity to explore this area of the palace. The innermost sector was reserved primarily for the immediate family of the Emperor and ministers from among the Chamber of the Dragon. As they descended, the carved stone walls gave way to gilded panels, great crystals mounted just behind, enchanted, so that their fiery light moved like free-flowing magma. The panels cast a warm glow through the halls, illuminating the finely woven mats that lay underfoot. They descended further still, and Kano took note of the silence that surrounded them as they moved further and further away from the palace's other inhabitants. Kano followed Akihiko, mouth pulled into a small frown. The more he thought about it, the more strange all of this seemed. While he'd never stepped foot inside this part of the palace, he had assumed it would be busy, filled with servants rushing to obey their masters, and ministers and lord wizards making their way to and from various engagements. Yet ever since he stepped foot in this part of the palace, he hadn't seen so much as a simple servant. "I didn't realise the chamber's halls were this deep," Kano remarked casually. The Lord Wizard stayed silent, his face hidden from view as the man walked 2 steps ahead of him. Kano quickened his pace slightly, turning his head to look at Akihiko's expression. His former mentor was completely unreadable, his grey eyes cold as steel. Kano frowned, noticing the stir of ether in the air, the telltale sign of a wizard preparing to cast a spell. His gaze flicked down to see a ripple of energy over the palms of Akihiko's hands, like the heat waves that rippled above Volkor's pools of molten magma. With a flick of the wrist, Kano caught the fireball thrown at him, allowing the heat to dissipate into the air. He caught the following wave of fire in the palms of his hands, allowing it to spin around him before whipping it back at the Lord Wizard. As he sidestepped another fireball, Kano began to draw on the ether around him, hands weaving a spell into being. The arcane energy began to build, and as Kano ducked to one side, he slashed a hand through the air, sending the burgeoning spell flying at Lord Wizard Akihiko. It connected with his energy, visibly dissipating as it smothered the Lord Wizard's arcane connection. Akihiko immediately froze, going completely still. Wide eyes stared back at Kano, his pupils constricted, the whites of his eyes showing around the iris. Startled, Kano took a step back, one hand forming an arcane barrier in front of him, and then very abruptly stopped. Even as he watched, the Lord Wizard's skin was taking on a grey pallor, irises and pupils fading to milky white, branches of violet-green veins showing through his pale skin. Slowly, Akihiko's lips drew back into a snarl, teeth bared, his hands curling into fists. The sound that he released was inhuman, an ear-splitting shriek that echoed down the length of the hall. Without warning, the man leapt at him, hands outstretched, clawing at Kano like a rabid animal. Reflexively, he tossed a fireball at his former mentor, who failed to dodge the flames heading straight toward him. The fireball immediately collided head-on. With another shrill, deafening shriek, the Lord Wizard collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony. Just as Kano stepped forward, unsure, smoke began to pour from the man's ears and nose, plumes of black smoke that flooded the hall with the smell of sulphur. Even as Kano drew the fire away, holding it at the ready, Akihiko continued to writhe on the floor, now eerily silent. With one final shudder, the Lord Wizard Akihiko went still, the last of the smoke escaping from his nostrils. After a long moment, Kano allowed the fire to extinguish, cautiously approaching the still form of his former mentor. Now that he lay still, Kano could suddenly see the Lord Wizard's sunken cheeks, the bluish pallor to his skin, the dark rings that circled his eyes. The skin on his hands was wrinkled and dry, his lips cracked, unseeing milky white eyes staring blankly into the middle distance. The sound of thunderous footsteps startled Kano out of his confusion, whipping around in time to see a host of armoured Imperial guards racing around the corner. As they came into view, Kano recognised the Lord Wizard at the front of the group, her alarmed gaze meeting his. As he watched, the Lord Wizard Chiyo's gaze fell to the body at his feet, shock rippling across her expression at the sight of Akihiko's corpse. Well, shit. This isn't what it looks like. The Lord Wizard Chiyo looked back up at Kano, jaw set, her expression shifting into one of horror.
Take him to the chamber of the dragon.
From the ashes, the Imperial Guards ushered him into the room, the Lord Wizard Chiyo close behind. As she stepped in front of him, the members of the Chamber of the Dragon all turned, looking down at the scene before them. Clearing her throat, the Lord Wizard turned her gaze to the Lord Chancellor himself.
Not 5 minutes ago, I heard a commotion in the halls of the inner palace. When I found the source of the noise, I found this young wizard standing over Lord Wizard Akihiko's body.
A low murmur rolled through the room as every member of the chamber began to speak at once, turning to quietly address their neighbours. The Lord Chancellor held up one hand, immediately silencing all those present. The Lord Chancellor was dressed in the elaborate garb of the Chamber of the Dragon, adorned in clothes of black and gold. His snow-white hair was drawn up into a metal hairpiece, depicting 3 ryoki leaping in and out of a stream of lava. Framed by prominent cheekbones, his eyes were startlingly bright for his age, a keen gaze landing on the young wizard before him.
What is your name?
Kano, Lord Chancellor.
You were found standing over the corpse of your former mentor, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were the one who killed him?
Kano paused, gathering his thoughts. He led me into a section of the palace where no one else was present, and then attacked me. I was acting out of self-defense.
You want us to believe that a Lord Wizard, one who mentored you, I might add, attacked you within the halls of the inner palace?
I know how it sounds. Kano stretched his hands out before him, palms up. But believe me, I don't have any reason to attack him. When I met the Lord Wizard Akihiko earlier, he wasn't acting like himself. The Lord Chancellor gazed down at him steadily, keen gaze fixed on Kano as he thought. Finally, with a wave of his hand, he motioned for Kano to continue speaking. We were discussing my trial of embers, he continued, neatly skipping the part where they discussed his cheating. And we happened to be discussing ether. I mentioned that the ether in Volcor felt unstable recently, as if something had thrown it out of balance. The Lord Wizard reacted as if I'd attacked him. And suddenly we decided we had to speak to the Chamber of the Dragon. He led me down into the inner palace, completely silent, and just as I began to suspect that something was wrong, he attacked me. As I was attempting to defend myself, I cast an attack back at him, which the Lord Wizard did not deflect or dodge. Almost immediately, smoke began to pour from his nose and ears. His skin turned grey, his eyes were sunken in. The man looked like a corpse. Even after evoking the flames, he was still writhing on the floor and smoking, and then, very suddenly, he was dead. Just like that. Taking a breath, Kano nodded to the Lord Wizard Chiyo and the Imperial Guards behind her. Ask them what he looked like. They'll tell you the exact same thing. The Lord Chancellor turned his gaze to the Lord Wizard Chiyo, raising his eyebrows expectantly.
He is technically correct. When I arrived, I did notice that something felt off about the Lord Wizard's appearance, but that could also be because of Kano's interference. I could tell that he cast some kind of spell before I found him that could be responsible for the physical condition of the Lord Wizard. However, the Lord Wizard was already in the process of burning by the time I arrived, and there is too much damage to the body to confirm Kano's account.
Kano? The Lord Chancellor began, voice heavy with warning.
Your account implies that you used only your inherent fire magic. If Chiyo is correct, and you cast an etheric spell, the chamber requires that information.
Yes, Kano admitted, one eyebrow raised. I did cast a spell, but that had nothing to do with the Lord Wizard's appearance. I interrupted his magic with a spell that temporarily severs a person's connection to arcane energy. The room broke into murmurs once again, only quieting when the Lord Chancellor intervened.
The spell would have prevented Akihiko from casting magic.
Yes, but only etheric spells. It doesn't affect innate fire magic, or at least it didn't when I was testing the spell. The Lord Chancellor sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his forehead.
I open the floor to the chamber at large.
This is preposterous. One of the grand strategists, a large man by the name of Jijo, rose from his seat, pointing down at Kano.
We've heard of this young man before. He has a reputation for trickery and lies. We have no reason to believe him.
I concur with Daijo. Remember when Kano... It took weeks for the stone to... He almost ruined. I cannot believe we're even considering... The hall burst into a cacophony of voices as the Chamber of the Dragon began to speak all at once, speaking over one another, voices raised as several members rose from their chairs. The Lord Chancellor looked increasingly unhappy as the councillors argued, bringing up long-forgotten insults, slights, and past trickery. Kano watched on silently, brow furrowed. With Akihiko's corpse marred by burns, it was going to be difficult to convince them that something else had happened to the Lord Wizard, something that he himself barely understood. Kano thought back on the second before Akihiko attacked him, remembering the pallor to his skin, his sunken eyes and bared teeth. The man had seemed almost as if he was, on some level, already dead. He still wasn't sure how it happened. The Lord Wizard, Akihiko, had seemed perfectly healthy when Kano first met with him that morning. So it had to have either come on very quickly or something had to have hidden the Lord Wizard's condition. But why? If it was a spell like the Lord Wizard Chiyo suspected, then someone could have possibly hidden the effects from view. But Akihiko himself would have still noticed what was happening to his own body. Even so, Kano couldn't help but feel that Chiyo was on the right track, judging by the way that Akihiko reacted to his spell earlier. Looking around the hall, Kano gazed at the members of the Chamber of the Dragon. While many were busy discussing or arguing the matter of Kano's involvement, he noticed that the grand strategist, Jijo, seemed more emphatic than the rest, veins bulging in his neck as he shouted. For a moment, it reminded him of Lord Wizard Akihiko's sudden aggression earlier. For a moment, it reminded him of Lord Wizard Akihiko's sudden aggression earlier. Kano frowned thoughtfully, thinking back on what the Lord Wizard Chiyo said. While it hadn't been his intention, his spell could have possibly caused the changes to his body by exposing what was already there. If there had been an arcane cause for Lord Wizard Akihiko's ailment, his spell might have interrupted the flow of ether just enough to reveal Akihiko's condition. That's why he reacted to my comment about ether, Kano muttered. There's a link. Raising his head, he looked to the Lord Chancellor, who was attempting to bring order back to the Chamber of the Dragon. As it stood, even the Lord Wizard next to him had been drawn into the argument, her focus entirely on the other members of the chamber. Neither were looking at Kano, and as he looked around the chamber, he got an idea. Calling ether into his grasp, Kano subtly began to work the same spell as earlier. If what had happened to Lord Wizard Akihiko was happening to anyone else, this could possibly expose it. And at the very least, The wizards among the chamber would take note of an interruption to the ether around them. Weaving the spell into being, Kano gave breath to the incantation, flicking the arcane energy out with his fingertips. The spell snapped across the room, striking the wizards among them with a slap. Some, however, reacted more strongly than others, and as the wizards of the room turned toward Kano, indignation on their faces, Kano looked over the members of the chamber in shock. Almost a third of the chamber were frozen in place, staring blankly into mid-air. As one, their faces drained of colour, exposing the bruised veins lying beneath their skin. Their lips turned blue, cheeks gaunt, as every pair of unseeing eyes turned to stare at Kano with the gaze of a blizzard, ice cold, empty, and howling. The Lord Chancellor, for his part, caught on quickly, gazing around the room with horror dawning on his face. One by one, the other members of the chamber began to realise what was happening, turning to look at their neighbours with expressions of alarm. Next to him, he heard the Lord Wizard Chio's sharp inhale. The tension in the room reached a tipping point, a moment of silence reigning as everyone froze in place. Kano watched as the grand strategist, Jijo, stared down at him, his dark expression morphing into a snarl. And with an ear-splitting shriek, he leapt forward. As Jijo attacked, all the others snapped out of their trance, turning on their former colleagues with screams and howls. The room broke into complete chaos, the wizards among them calling on their innate fire as the grand strategists and lord generals drew their blades. Before Jijo even reached Kano, the Lord Wizard Chio stepped in, shooting a wave of fire at the grand strategist. The flames poured from her hands, covering Jijo completely and setting him alight. As he began to shriek, smoke pouring from his ears and nose, something flew out from his open mouth. A tiny, ink-black creature collided with the floor, no longer or thicker than Kano's little finger. Shining in the light of the flames, it went still, evaporating into black smoke a second later. With a flourish, Kano ignited the air around him, allowing the fire to burn brighter and brighter, forming a pillar of white-hot flames. Another councillor of the chamber came running at Kano, a dagger in his hand. With a wave of his hand, Kano set the man alight, stopping him just shy of attacking. A quick glance proved that the rest of the room had broken into a full battle as the remaining members of the chamber tried to stop their attackers. The Lord Chancellor backed away from the podium, several of the ministers stepping in to form a barrier between the Chancellor and the afflicted. Just as Kano stepped forward, fire at the ready, he was halted by a deep rumble in the air, a dragon's roar, unmistakable in its power and intensity, sounded through the hall, vibrating the air with the force of a thunderclap. The very floor beneath their feet shook with its power as the ether around them stirred at its call. Instantaneously, each of the changed councillors burst into flame. One by one, they collapsed to the floor, smoke pouring from their burning bodies, their combined shrieks climbing higher in pitch until finally they were unable to be heard at all. At last, there was silence, the last of the afflicted expiring in a puff of ash. The gilded panel at the very back of the hall opened, its golden surface opening to reveal the resplendent uniforms of the Emperor's personal guard. Stepping out and to the side, they parted to reveal the Emperor himself, the Empress at his side. His robes were scarlet, trimmed with gold, partially hidden beneath grand ceremonial armour, resembling the scales of the great dragon itself. His shoulders were covered by great pauldrons, tipped with an obsidian claw, opening into a cloak made to resemble dragon wings. His hair was barely visible behind his headdress, a plume of gilded dragon's fire, the point of each flame crowned with enchanted verlin feathers. A mask covered his face from view, sculpted from obsidian and gold to form the face of a dragon. Through the gaps in the mask, his eyes were just barely visible, almost appearing to glow. At his side, the Empress was similarly dressed, her elaborate crimson dress framed in dragon armour. A cloak hung from her great shoulder pauldrons, framing her dress in ink-black silk, gold embroidery shining at the edges of the fabric. Lava crystals were embedded in her grand hairpiece, interspersed with great plumes of enchanted fire. Their entourage entered just behind them, made smaller by comparison, their heads bowed in deference. One by one, the members of the chamber followed suit, quickly falling to their knees before the figure of their emperor. From where he kneeled, Kano could see the Lord Chancellor's profile, watching as the man's expression revealed his growing panic. Even as the Lord Chancellor made to speak, the Emperor waved a hand, instantly silencing him. For a long moment, nobody in the room dared to breathe. The Empress at his side was unreadable behind her half-mask, cool and collected next to the Emperor's rage. At his signal, Imperial guards entered, gathering the scattered remains of the afflicted councillors. The remaining members of the Chamber of the Dragon watched on silently, expressions carefully blank, but tension clear in the set of their shoulders. Rising from his position on the floor, the Lord Chancellor kept his head bowed, silently following the Emperor and Empress back into the passageway. The entourage blocked them from view as they retreated into the inner palace, the gilded panel sliding shut behind them. For almost 2 days, Kano heard nothing further, excluded from the Chamber of the Dragon's discussions. Finally, someone came to collect him, his uniform identifying him as one of the Imperial family's personal retinue. With some amount of apprehension, Kano followed him down into the innermost sanctum of the palace. The guard led him into a hidden room, its doorway masked by the panels decorating the halls. It was almost indistinguishable from its surroundings, unless you knew exactly where to look. The guard remained standing nearby, staring directly ahead, waiting. Kano looked at the room around him, choosing to remain standing. The seconds stretched into minutes, time crawling slowly by as Kano waited. Based solely on the man who came to collect him and the location of the room they were now in, he suspected he was meeting a member of the immediate Imperial family. The better question was why a member of the Imperial family would want to speak to him. Finally, the panel slid open, revealing 2 more guards from the Imperial family's personal retinue. They parted to reveal the head of the Alshoni faction, Lord Wizard and cousin to the Emperor, accompanied by the Lord Chancellor. As she took a seat, he motioned for Kano to do the same. A long moment passed as she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the younger wizard, something thoughtful lingering in her expression.
Almost a year ago, the Chamber of the Dragon discovered that one of the Lord Generals had been, for lack of a better word, possessed. Several of the Lord Wizards studied his corpse and found that an unknown creature had taken control of his body, and that its presence caused a number of issues, including tissue death. They uncovered several more of these creatures inside the royal court and removed each of them.
The Lord Wizards have continued to monitor the court since then, and after a time, these creatures stopped appearing.
The Lord Wizard Yama paused, motioning to the Lord Chancellor at her side.
The Lord Chancellor reported that the creatures had been eradicated, and while we hadn't uncovered where the creatures came from, we decided to put our focus onto the matter of ether. The Lord Chancellor mentioned that you expressed concerns about ether stability, so I assume you've also noticed a change in the ether across Volcor.
Yes, Kano replied, looking between the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Wizard. I notice that the ether across Volcor has been more unstable in the last few years. When I saw that some wizards were struggling to control their fire magic, I suspected that the two might be related.
Yama nodded. The cause is an etheric imbalance which has been disturbing etheric spells in Volcor for almost a decade. However, more recently, it has also been causing problems with basic fire magic, which should be unaffected by ether. We decided to put our focus into solving the issue, not realizing that the creatures we discovered had begun to mutate and found new ways to go unnoticed. Thanks to your encounter with Lord Wizard Akihiko, we have uncovered more of these imposters and are training others in a spell to detect their presence. It is my understanding that you have yet to receive a title. The Emperor himself has decided to create one for you, thanks in part to your role in uncovering the creatures within our court.
At her signal, one of the guards produced a staff, carved from pure obsidian to resemble a dragon, a crystal floating just within reach of its open maw.
The trachea of ether, while a gift, does not come without responsibility. The Council of the Dragon wants you to look into the etheric disturbance. Just as you uncovered the creatures, we would like you to uncover the truth behind what is happening to our wizards and find a way to reverse the change. You yourself just spoke about your affinity with ether. We believe that this gives you a unique ability to uncover more about the ether imbalance.
Taking the staff from the guard, she stood, hands outstretched, offering the staff to Kano.
This is the Crucible of Etherweave, an heirloom which was once gifted to your ancestor by the past emperor. Accept this, and you accept your role as the Drachia of Ether.
Rising from his seat, Kano stared down at the staff before him, looking over the carved obsidian scales. He could feel the enchanted crystal, even at a distance, an eternal flame dancing within. After a long moment, he grinned, reaching out to accept the staff from the Lord Wizard Yama. In his hands, the staff appeared to awaken, firelight dancing between the obsidian scales. He felt the ether around him stir in response, arcane energy channeling through the core of the staff. With a laugh, he nodded, straightening. Drachia of Ether. I like the sound of that. Sound of that. Sound of that. Sound of that. Sound of that.